Hi, I'm Kayla Hathaway, a partner here at Simpatico Studios. Simpatico is a platform dedicated to cultivating conversations and actions on complex social issues with professionals all around the world. On the Climate EDU channel, I interview academics about university programs, careers, research, internships, and published literature like books and papers. If you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now, on to today's show. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Climate EDU. I am your host, Kayla Hathaway, and once again, I am joined by the incredible Jeff Slegelmilch. And for those who do not know who Jeff is, he is the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University. In this role, he oversees the operations and strategic planning for the center. He's also advised leaders on preparedness systems and policy at all levels of government, and is the author of the book Rethinking Readiness. In today's episode, Jeff is going to be talking about Chapter 3 of his book Rethinking Readiness, which covers critical infrastructure failure. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me once again. How is your Thursday going?
Not too bad. Great to be back here. Always good to chat with you, Kayla. How's your day going? A week? Last 7 days? I don't know. What's the etiquette here?
Time is relative.
Fair enough.
Yeah. It's been pretty good. Things are pretty mellow and just busy. Simpatico has been busy, which is wonderful.
It's a good thing.
Yes. All right, so critical infrastructure failure. Let's go ahead and jump right on into it. Give us like a little introduction of the chapter, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, so our world is built on a lot of stuff, and some of that stuff is really old, and we like to cut ribbons and build new stuff, but we don't plan very well in terms of maintaining it. In addition to that, when we talk about public works and public infrastructure, things are just more and more complicated. I mean, imagine if you wanted to build a new highway through LA, or even recently, just the complexity of the high-speed rail projects that were originally thought to going to be able to connect LA, San Francisco, Sacramento, and then sort of being downsized, land rights, usage, things like that. There's a lot of different players that are involved. So that in and of itself is just sort of how civil society works and how complex societies work. But the challenge is that what we end up with is these vulnerabilities that are just sort of growing in terms of the kinds of things that could go wrong, that could be more and more disruptive. We see hints of this with the bridge collapse a few years ago in Minnesota, with the Amtrak derailment, things like that. But then we see larger scale, like the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, and the evacuation downstream of the Oroville Dam. And we start to realize that some of these are actually, in addition to sort of inconveniences, can actually be true disasters, and in some cases mega disasters of the scope that we might not be as ready as we think we are for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we go and dive into the details of the book, you open up with the dam first, like what was the
Oroville Dam, actually.
Oroville Dam. Yes, I was like, it's like just the dam is going to burst. I'm like, oh wait, where's the name of the dam? Yeah, Oroville. And so this disaster, like, when we think of massive infrastructure projects like dams, like just what causes them to fail? Like, is it poor management, just materials, or
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, the Oroville Dam, and another example in the beginning, I think it's pronounced Vajont, Vajont Dam in Italy many decades ago. They had actually engineered that particular dam burst was from an avalanche causing waves that overtopped the dam up in the mountains, and they had actually engineered for a tsunami caused by those effects. They just didn't engineer it for one that big. And this is something I actually learned, the expert I interviewed, George Diodatis, in the book. In terms of Oroville, historic rainfalls and then the spillway. And there were concerns over the years that the evacuation roads weren't sufficient to get out of the way of the dam downstream. And for a variety of reasons, those weren't followed through on. And then all of a sudden, there was this situation that got pretty dire at one point, to the point where they ordered the evacuation of nearly 200,000 residents downstream. And there's, images in the papers of the headlights on the evacuation route. And of course, all these stories came of when it was put forward and denied and things like that. But I think these near misses are actually extraordinarily important to understand because we nearly had 200,000 internally displaced people in this country. This is a refugee situation of a magnitude that we haven't really had to deal with. We came close with Hurricane Katrina and the diaspora from that. But in this case, to have an entire community destroyed where people can't come back, we're not talking about evacuation shelters. We're talking about refugees
Yeah.
within our borders. And so that always stuck with me as just something that foretold a vulnerability and a type of domestic response that we've only really imagined in the international and humanitarian sector from the US perspective.
Yeah, no, like the idea of there being 200,000 just refugees in the States, like already, like we don't have the means to go and I mean, if we take a look at just what's happening with the fires in California, like how do we even get these people to evacuate? Where do they even go? What kind of resources do we get to them? And you see images similarly where it's like you just have one road,
Mhm.
like in order to get out, and you're like, oh, well, hopefully, maybe they won't be traffic, but it's like this is literally the only route to leave. And like going into like so we have just access and or kind of mentioning a moment ago where they planned for a big wave but just didn't plan for something that big. It sounds like some planning is a bit too conservative and that we should be kind of preparing for like the worst case when we're building these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's both the job of mitigation and prevention as well as consequence management. And so we really have to think along both sides.
Mhm.
And in my interview with George Diodatis, and some of it's in the book, some of it is one day I want to find a way to unearth the archives, the full conversations I had, because there's so many tangents and really just interesting things that didn't fit in the book.
Mhm.
But talking about how, there are certain situations where we just need to over engineer.
Yeah.
Nuclear power plants are built to an extraordinarily high safety level, but the consequences of failure are so great.
Mhm.
You almost have to go beyond the realms of the imagination to engineer that. When we talk about dams as another example of that. So really what we see, with Oroville, the near misses are one, what were the warning signs that were missed in terms of causing this near collapse, and as well as the example in Italy where it was engineered for, but just not to that scale, not to that scope. So it's not like planning isn't done. But then also to be thinking through, what if it does break? What if the unimaginable does happen? And a lot of times this gets shut down, especially in nuclear power. It's something that within the Earth Institute, there's even a little bit of debate. We come from the disaster side and the consequences of a failure with nuclear power. A lot of our colleagues are primarily focused on clean energy and the benefits of nuclear power. So it makes for some very lively discussions at times. But that's
Mhm.
how it should be, right? We should be talking about the trade-offs. What are the risks? What are the benefits? So that's all good. That's the way we should be arguing.
Mhm.
But what that means is then what are your plans, right? So in the cases of, as you mentioned, you have these areas with one road in, one road out.
Yeah.
You know, I was out in LA back in December and with some colleagues from the fire department driving up Tiger Tail Road, where near the Getty burn over there,
Yeah.
burn site, and that's not an easy road to get up and around on. Now imagine being in a big piece of fire apparatus trying to get down there, right? Or multiple
Yeah.
and trying to coordinate. So there are things that we like about the way we live that make it harder to manage disasters when they happen. And there are real trade-offs that maybe the consequences weren't as likely and weren't as great 50 years ago, but with longer fire seasons and things like that, the math is different now,
Mhm.
and we need to take a hard look at that.
Yeah, especially as the climate crisis continues to
Mhm.
persist, and then we have to really look at our our maths and our civil engineering. And so moving on, like to the next portion of your chapter, we you mentioned Flint, and Flint, Michigan, is still still struggling. So if you like, just kind of what happened with Flint, could it have been prevented? And
Yeah.
what can we do now about what's
So
going on there?
So for those who aren't aware, if you want to look at generations of social injustice and bureaucratic incompetence, look at the story of Flint, Michigan. Look at the financial crisis is that have happened in that region with kind of the deindustrialization, and then under this practice to try and save some money, they switched over from buying their water from Detroit to bringing it in through the Flint River, and there was a whole myriad of challenges of outdated infrastructure, needing more time to do it. But essentially, what happened is you started having leaching in through the pipes coming in from the Flint River.
Mhm.
And nobody knew about it at first. And then people knew about it, but nobody talked about it. There actually, I believe there was some criminal indictments as a result of this. There were, for an extended period of time, there were children drinking water tainted with lead. There were people bathing in this water, complaining of skin conditions and that their skin was burning. And it wasn't until a pediatrician actually blew the whistle on these chronic elevated lead levels in children that she was seeing that this finally got the attention that it deserved. Now, this is a low socioeconomic, majority minority community, low social capital, low in terms of influence with the state. But then you start looking into this. Our former director, now the director of our pandemic response initiative at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post actually saying that, look, if you can't fix the water, you have to evacuate the town. You have children in harm's way. These are things we had never even evacuate a town in the US of that size, so that we should never have to do that. Again, a situation that actually required us to think about the unthinkable. And it really has taken, things still aren't back to normal in Flint, Michigan. There was a little bit of a spotlight shown on the social inequities and some of the events that led to this from more the social perspective. With the folks may remember, the one of the debates was held in Flint, Michigan, in the 2016 presidential election cycle. That helped shine a light on some of it for a brief moment, but I doubt many people have thought about it until we started talking about it again. So that's an example of really social inequities, areas where we've stopped investing, where you change things over to make a buck and the infrastructure is old, there aren't enough people to operate it, something bad happens. If it happened in a rich majority white neighborhood in the suburbs of Detroit, I'm not sure that it would have persisted for so long or been so bad.
Yeah, it'd be suddenly, oh my gosh, we have to go and do something. Like it's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
wealthy are being affected.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And this actually speaks a lot too in terms of this like political capital in which communities have access to their government officials and have the attention of it. The
Hmm.
Daniel Aldrich talks about vertical integration, vertical social capital, and didn't have it. There was no one paying attention to this until it, not even until it reached a breaking point, until it was so far past the breaking point, it was growing impossible to ignore.
Hmm. Yeah, no, every time I see like information about Flint, I'm just like, how have we not? But it's just
It's worth
yeah.
noting too that actually does not classify as a major disaster under the Stafford Act, which is the primary authority for determining disaster response for FEMA and for a lot of the federal apparatus. There are two tiers: an emergency declaration, which has a very broad definition, and then there's a major disaster declaration, which really opens up a lot more money, a lot more resources, a lot more programs. But because it was caused by infrastructure, it wasn't a natural hazard. It's not eligible for that declaration. So another point that I like to make in this too is that as much of a disaster as Flint is, our legislative readiness to respond is not there,
Mhm.
whether at the state level, whether at the federal level. And then of course there was infighting over who was really responsible. Was it more of a state issue or a federal issue? But the
Yeah.
resources from the federal disaster response apparatus were only available in a much reduced amount because
Mhm.
of the way we define disasters.
So it sounds like we definitely need like new legislation to go and redefine things as we continue to have like different kinds of issues moving forward.
Mhm.
Um, and so on to the next section, which is also something that like I'm sure we're going to need to have like more policy on going forward is like access to the grid and electricity. And so in the section, like, so what makes like the grid like so critical? Um,
Yeah, there's so many different elements of modern life that are connected to electricity, right? Webcasts, our
yeah.
phones, all of these other things. But I think perhaps even more importantly, is that a lot of people are managing chronic conditions from home. A lot of
Mhm.
people, we don't have people in hospitals for as long anymore. They're providing home health services, things like that. Um, and so this could actually be a death sentence for a lot of folks. Someone who can take care of themselves, who can plug in, who's on an oxygen concentrator, who's on home ventilators, all kinds of different things. All of a sudden, the lights go out. If you can't afford a generator or you don't have one that switches back on, you're now trying to beat the clock.
Yeah.
Where do you go? So we saw an extreme example of this in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, where it was normally a year, excuse me, approximately a year before the whole island had power again. You see these enormous death rates, depending on what the methodology is, but it's typically well over 3,000. And some of the biggest causes are actually what we call indirect deaths. We're starting to see more and more indirect deaths from disasters. So a direct death from a hurricane would be a piece of wood hitting you in the head, drowning in the floodwaters or something like that. The indirect death would be a heart attack while trying to chop up this tree that fell on your house, or lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to medication. So everything from and then of course we have the other issues of food storage, of being able to return to work, of kids being able to return to school, and even greater social impacts from failures of the electric grid. But the good news is there's actually a lot of work being done in this regard at the Earth Institute. There's a center focused on energy policy, and they just released a roadmap for modernizing the grid and getting to, with the focus on green energy, but also renewable energies. The grid we have now is based on major distribution hubs and then sort of pushing that out to the masses. New technologies get us more towards microgrids, shorter distance that we have to generate and move electricity to. We're doing some work with a utility in the Midwest as well too, looking at this intersection of grids and disaster and things like that. So there's some folks working on it, but it's a big piece of infrastructure that in some cases is 50 years old or more, and it's not a simple thing to go in and just swap it out.
Mhm. You're like, okay, here's a new thing. It's there, ready to go.
That's right. It's not like when you get your phone re-upped, right?
Man, I wish you could just like go and drop in, and be like, all right, here's the new grid, y'all. It's fine.
Yeah. I will say there's some pilot projects that move in very quickly and get a lot of attention. So we take a look at Puerto Rico. A colleague actually at this utility and I wrote an op-ed in the Hill about it. In Puerto Rico, there's a glimpse of the future. You have like the Tesla battery farm at the Children's Hospital. I think that's the one at the Children's Hospital. And you sort of have the beneficiaries of philanthropy or generosity of folks looking to do a pilot project. So in the earthquake, when the power went out again, the recent earthquakes in Puerto Rico, these places stayed lit. It demonstrated that these areas were still lit. But you only had access to that in these small islands, again, where these microgrids or these battery farms or whatever were put there through another person's generosity, or more frequently through a company that's putting an investment through a donation to be able to prove and sell it to others. So there's definitely some inequities in that as well too that we need to be very careful of.
No, I completely agree. There's definitely a lot of fine lines when it comes to like philanthropy and development, and it's like, all right,
Yeah.
like, let's take a look here. Um, and there's been, I'm sure you've probably seen this, but like new proposed like Amtrak routes, like
Yep.
trains all across the United States. Oh my gosh. And you mentioned next part in this chapter is the derailment of the Amtrak 180 in Philadelphia in 2015. And so what's up with like roads and rails? Like how I mean, we already know like California, like we're constantly doing rebuilding of our like freeways all the time. There's constantly construction, literally all the time. Um, yeah, what's going on with our railways and our roads, our freeways?
Yeah, so it is one of these things, and of course, there's a whole sordid history between why we have roads versus rail, and Europe is the opposite. Some of it has to do with subsidies, some of it has to do with just early monopolistic strategies of kind of buying the tracks and ripping them up. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
interesting things there. And actually, I believe if you do the math, that if you look at all the money put into roads, there's actually the subsidies are at or greater than the levels of rail. But I think I heard that somewhere, but it might have been on the West Wing. But anyway,
Hmm. You know,
fictional
I,
TV.
I saw that on Twitter earlier today where it was like it's like 2 trillion a year for
Yeah,
vehicles, whereas for rails it's only like in the billions. And
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like, oh, so
yeah.
we'd be saving a lot of money if we did that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other is Amtrak as a public service, like much like the post office, doesn't have the flexibility to operate like a business would. So it can't
Mhm.
make a lot of the strategic investments with the same agility and flexibility as another organization in the private sector. Even if they're competing with them, a lot of times they're using the same tracks that are owned by the freight lines and things like that. So it really has not had the investment in the infrastructure to have things like reliability and showing up on time. I'm fortunate in the Northeast corridor. We've got a pretty good rail system between in the Northeast, and I'd sometimes take the train down to DC when there isn't a global pandemic. Uh,
Yeah.
but uh, uh, but a lot of these new upgrades and safety features are expensive,
Mhm.
and they're a worthy investment. But again, you don't necessarily have that ability. In this case, it's Congress that really has to appropriate the funds to be able to do that. The operating revenue of Amtrak, they're chronically in shortfall, and much like the post office is very much in chronic shortfall, and it's creating a lot of controversy now, right? Because it's linked to
Mhm.
the election and absentee ballots. But there's actually, absent the pandemic, a very serious challenge there between we either need to subsidize it more or provide it the freedom to operate um, in a competitive landscape. And that's a tough trade-off because you don't want to give it more because there's only so much money. But at the same time, if you let it make decisions solely based on where it'll make the most money, it's probably not going to make a lot of money in Flint, Michigan, or in
Mhm.
other communities that are already sort of disenfranchised and maybe rely on these services more than, or at least as much as other communities. So these are tough conversations, but uh, they need to be had.
Yeah. And it sounds like, as you wrap up this chapter, just kind of like why infrastructure resilience is so difficult. It sounds like a large part is one, like the tough conversations for sure. And a lot of these conversations people don't want to have because they're incredibly uncomfortable. Um, and then also just the cost. Like it costs a lot of money to go and, continue to retrofit and upgrade. Like, I mean, great example, we talk about the Green New Deal and they're like, oh, it's going to cost so much money to go and make our buildings like more
Yeah.
insulated and everything like that.
And it's also I hate to use such a cliche term, but the not in my backyard, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
you know everybody agrees to these things in principle, but the minute you want to build it in their neighborhood, I when I'm in the city, I stay on the Upper West Side. The Upper West Side, the very, very progressive area, a lot of wealth. They've started putting a lot of the homeless population in some of the hotels on the Upper
Okay.
West Side. Residents are furious with the increase in
Really?
the homeless in the neighborhood. Probably some of the biggest proponents you would see about somebody else's neighborhood. And so again, I didn't just come on here to throw shade at the Upper West Side, but given the opportunity, no, but it just demonstrates we're all idealistic until we have to make a sacrifice, until we have to um, give a bank account or in bureaucracies, everybody talks a big game until they have to provide an account number.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's the ultimate. One of two things has to happen. We either have to find different ways of explaining value. As much as we wish that there was, maybe compassion isn't enough. You have to speak in other people's interests, or we have to like that compassion. We have to call it out where we see it. We have to tell people that this better future that we're talking about may in fact require some sacrifice. And again, I can sit here and preach this and sound like I'm saying words of wisdom, and then the next time I'm confronted with with one of these choices, I'll probably think twice about it. I'm certainly not immune from biases towards my own advantage.
So you're saying, like, if I say, "Hey, we need $10,000 to like get simpatico going,"
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But uh, with
like,
some of these infrastructure projects too, when you're talking about utilities, you have ratepayers who don't want to see their rates go up. You have
yeah,
regulators, you have legislators that are responsible for this. If they want to build something new, if you want to build a dam or you want to retrofit a dam, which neighborhoods are going to be, everyone. I live in the Chicago area. I went to college out there. Everyone complained on how awful O'Hare was with the delays, Chicago O'Hare Airport. All of the runways came and crisscrossed across each other. Yeah, so you had like all these
what?
runways, but you actually had this bottleneck because they all kind of crisscrossed. And so
Why?
there were,
Why would who approved that design? Like what?
well, and I think that that's a lot of our cities too. They're built on old
Hmm.
infrastructure and old designs. And I think part of it was to keep it from expanding its footprint because there were all these different designs. And now, if you go there, they're in parallel, and it's a lot more like Atlanta or other areas. I think there's still a long runway that cuts across, but it had to extend beyond its footprint. There was some housing that was a lot cheaper because it was right next to the airport that they
Hmm.
had to take from eminent domain. And so again, it's an infrastructure upgrade. And then you have the city politics, the state politics. It's a federal transportation, so you have to deal with that. You have people you have to kick out of their homes, which is no small thing.
Yeah.
And disrupting lives of people. Even if it's fair market value, are you compensating for taking their kids out of school, uprooting, figuring out where to live, longer commute? So none of these conversations are simple. If you had two people talking to each other, it'd be extraordinarily complex. Here you have
Hmm.
20 different parties talking together. And again, it's like I say a lot, these problems aren't impossible. They're just really, really hard.
Yeah.
You have to thread that needle where interests align, or you have to bully your way through. And then there's always winners and losers. And the losers tend to be those who are set up to fail
Hmm.
through various inequities and things like that.
Yeah. But it sounds like with anything, we need to have deeper conversations and they need to be normalized. As opposed to kind of like beating around the bush and be like, I don't really want to get like political about this. And it's like, no, I mean like lives are literally at stake here. So let's talk about it.
Mhm.
um, well, this has gone by incredibly swiftly, and next week we have you on to talk about I think it's
Yeah, I'm gonna have to
cyber threats.
I got to reread that chapter. I got to tell you, I relied on some friends for that one for sure. But yeah, really interesting one. And actually, I think, cyber is as much a part of infrastructure as anything else, but it's got some crazy stuff going on there. Is next week? Oh, it's going to be right before the election too. So we can talk about
Oh,
cybersecurity and
yes.
elections.
We can talk about like all the what is like digital polling and everything like that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. As well as sort of back end ways to disrupt confidence in elections. You guys should tune in
Mhm.
next week for sure. It's going to be very timely with the election. And yeah.
It will be I'm just here like it's gonna be great, but I'm like, do I really want to know about all this?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me again, Jeff. We're gonna roll into just chatting. I'm gonna play the credits and we'll be right back.
Awesome. My pleasure. Great to talk.
And we're back. Yay!
All right. Another one in the can.
Yes. All right. So I have a question from Mike. He's asking Jeff, how much does gerrymandering factor into the establishing of our infrastructure, and what needs to be addressed first on a district level before we can implement new infrastructure?
That is a great question that I'm going to answer in a very roundabout, not direct way.
Okay, go for it.
I would say first and foremost, if you're interested in gerrymandering, look up the Gerrymandering Project from 538. It was a podcast series that was done, about half a dozen, give or take, where they talked to different experts and actually looked at this, both the overt use of gerrymandering as well as sort of natural kind of packing and sorting that people do. This is one of those things where you can draw lines around districts and split districts to have more red versus blue or vice versa. in the state overall, and but also people naturally move and shift and sort and pack. Really fascinating if you want to geek out on gerrymandering and lose a good part of the day listening to podcasts. So or have a
Sounds
long
good.
drive, I guess. But you're not supposed to be going anywhere right now, so yeah, lose a
Just
day.
like
Anyway,
an aimless drive,
that's
listening to
right.
podcasts.
Your electric vehicle.
There we go.
It's hard to stay on brand. Okay.
Hmm.
But the question is with that. So that is definitely part of it for sure, because the regulatory environment, sort of the value environment, uh, uh, sometimes these proposals are put forward by city councils, they're put forward by state legislatures, things like that. When we're talking about investments of taxpayer dollars and subsidies and things like that, clearly the political representation has a lot to do with that. There's also a big role for the public. A lot of times it's public hearings and public outcry for the not in my backyard, and you have to make the case to the public. I have a friend who's an architect and was doing some work on a project in New York, and there were a lot of concerns about that the public had about this project, and it turned out no one had ever talked to them. So I went to this meeting and did like a ask till you drop, sort of answered every single
Oh
question,
no.
put it all in the presentation, and was basically, here's what we're doing. That's not what we said. We'll be doing this. Huge investment in time and energy, but it was what was needed. For the citizenry, for the residents of the area. And then you have these private sector groups, which can range from, they're funding this, they're investing in this, they're the ones doing the building, and they want to see a return in investment. What are their incentives for building it up green and building it up to code? And of course, special interests. They can be a good thing, they can be a bad thing. So I would say that it's part of it. And in terms of gerrymandering, that obviously can load the dice in one way or another, in terms of what you're trying to do, but it's just one side of the dice. I really abuse that analogy, but I think you know what I'm saying though, right? Yeah, it's one component, it's a significant component, but there's a lot of other components that are not exclusively gerrymandering. Although I should say too, for when we talk about the non engineered gerrymandering, so what I mean by that, not the natural gerrymandering where we naturally coalesce around areas. A lot of people with more liberal ideologies tend to cluster around high density urban areas. Not exclusively, but so natural gerrymandering would probably align more with citizen values and corporate culture and things like that in those areas versus I think your question is getting at the more engineered gerrymandering where you're going in there and drawing lines on maps to maximize the number of seats for your respective party.
Yeah, no, gerrymandering, the moment that I started learning about it, I'm like, how is this allowed? Like, you see just how I don't know. Like, it's one of those things where the more I look at it, like how we mentioned like before we started, like my feelings towards like primary voting and everything. I'm like, how is this even allowed anymore?
Yeah.
Like,
The, this series is actually really fascinating to hear about things like in Arizona, some of the challenges, people coming in just wanting to do well, and then the firm that is doing the maps also takes contracts with some of the political parties, and it's like, oh, they're doing what a business does, but then all of a sudden you have a narrative that they're setting this up to meet an agenda, and in a very polarized world. I would say too that I don't think gerrymandering is the primary issue. I think it's the polarization that we feed into on both sides of the political spectrum. The it is one thing to sort of pack folks who are sympathetic to what you think, but it's another thing to really there's such extraordinary hostility right now, and that has continued to grow. And I think with the current administration being so egregious with so many of its statements and approaches, it's easy to think of this as a one-sided issue. But I'd say back up from that and think about who's voting for these folks and why. And it can't be that 45% or more of the nation are sociopaths. There must be something that's not being met in the platform. We need to understand this because these are the folks coming to public hearings with some of these questions, and we need a better way than yelling to engage in public debate.
yeah, I feel like I need to go and pick up what is like some sociology books or something about like just why the current climate is the way it is, and like why the kind of discussions we're having now are the way that we're having them, because it's just so mind-boggling. I picked up the book Politics is for Power by Ethan Hirsch, I think it
Mhm.
is. And I've just got through the first like two chapters, and it's talking about how politics is just so like sportsman-y, and it's like my side, their side. Like we've turned it into a spectacle rather than
Yeah.
actual governance.
Yeah.
And I'm here like, so how do we fix this?
Uh, a colleague of mine, now a friend of mine, was interviewing for a position, and had come from was on the interview panel at the time. This is when I first met him. He was coming as a chief of staff in a state elected official's office and had worked as a communications director and things like that. And I don't even remember what the question was that we asked him, but he said, there's the election season and there's the governing season. And the election season is, and he laid out what that was, and the governing season are these months. They said that's the time you have to do things. And he was just explaining how that dynamic was, that in the election season, it's very difficult to work across the aisle. In the governing season, that's your opening to do it, and was sort of laying it all out. It feels like the governing season is less and less these days,
Yeah.
and in some cases non-existent anymore. And I think that maybe we can tolerate a certain degree of the blood sport of politics in the run up to the election, but we need some time to govern.
I
So
completely. Um, the way that this administration has done some things, uh,
yeah,
especially
yeah,
with like all the environmental rollbacks and all of that. Like I could hop off about this and talk about this for hours. But we do have other episodes coming up, so I'm not going to go and take Lee's time from this. But no, it's like a lot needs to change, and it's that kind of like unfortunate realization. I think AOC actually has this, or maybe it was Bernie. Like one of the squad, was talking about how if you don't see your representation and your ideas, then you should run for that position. And I'm here like,
yeah.
well, dang it, guess I'm eventually gonna be involved in politics. And
I, I'd also say too that kind of flocking to areas where you're kind of surrounded by your own ideas, there can be a lot of comfort in that, but that's also some of the natural gerrymandering that's occurring. It's why you have such concentration on either coast, but actually an electoral advantage for you. Sort of have a population advantage for the Democrats, and an electoral advantage for the Republicans. And so there's definitely a divide there that needs to be understood. But I'd also say too, a lot of these rollbacks were made possible because they were done through executive action or done through regulations, and when they're done through legislation, it's a lot harder to roll them back. And so a lot of these things that were put in place by the Obama administration were done because they could not get put in place by through the Congress, because they couldn't get the votes to do it. And as such, the Trump administration has rolled them back. If there's a Biden administration, I'm sure they'll reinstate these. But that's how it is, right there. And there's actually certain executive orders that just on day one they put in place and get rolled back as when the parties change. And regulations are a little harder, but to roll back. But as you can see, there are mechanisms. There's a review process, things like that. But when it's embedded in law, unless it's unconstitutional, um, that's really what's missing, I think, in a lot of environmental protections. We have
oh
some,
yeah,
the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, but
even those have been. I mean, California's Clean Air Act. They've been Trump's administration's been fighting us about that forever.
yep,
And even like I just remember like what was it, day one? They started like the lawsuit or something. We talked about this in my environmental law class, and I'm like, what, 14, 15 other states that
mhm,
have adopted our Clean Air Act, and you're just gonna tell that like hearing
yeah.
about this? I'm like, what? They go flip table, like why?
You may have come across them in your coursework, but for folks watching too, the Sabin Center for I think climate law or something. It's one of the affiliated centers with the Earth Institute as well, and it's based in Columbia Law School, and they work full time on these issues as well too, these lawsuits and looking at the legal analysis and things like that as it relates to climate change, clean energy, things like that. So it's they have a ton of resources there as well too for really breaking this down. But Anyway, just another resource for the civically minded individuals out there who want to sue somebody.
Who want to sue somebody?
I
Or
grew up in California. It's a litigious environment.
I know, like seriously, I'm gonna go and sue you. Like, so we're gonna go and just go and sue the government, obviously. Like, there we go.
I don't see a downside, do you? Yeah.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me again this week. I look forward to seeing you again next week, and feel free to hop out of the Zoom call whenever you're ready, and have a fantastic rest of your week and also weekend as well.
Awesome. Likewise. I'll see you in another week. And yeah, always great to chat. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, rest well. Bye.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
All right, lovelies. So I believe, let me double check to make sure. And yes, there is an election, Doug. There's actually a presidential debate happening in an hour and 20 minutes. And see who's joining today. Lee and Doug. Oh my gosh. Send y'all the information. Yeah, no, there's there's a debate happening tonight, and I am very well. We'll see how it all goes. That's for sure. I'm curious. I saw that they're going to be actually muting microphones, which will be interesting. Oh, hey, Doug.
Hey.
All right, looks like your video's not pulling up. There you are. All right, I'm going to put you in here.
Let me switch something out here.
Yeah, so are you excited for the debate tonight?
You know, I got to turn off. I'm not used to coming on as a guest. I had audio on in Simpatico and then audio on in Zoom. I'm like, what's going on?
Kayla's being heard in 3 directions.
I know. Yeah, so that actually starts in 15 minutes, doesn't it?
Or it starts at 6 p.m. Pacific. So it starts in about
really?
an
I thought
hour.
it said 8. I thought maybe I was looking at a different time. And I get, we're on the Pacific and they don't respect us out here. They throw out these times and it's always just Eastern dominated. So I'm going to try to, we're doing something, but I'm going to have it on in the background. So for sure.
All right, let me go and just making sure your stuff here is all set up before I go and transition to you. Let me, where did this go? But
I think did you see her note, Lee's note?
yeah, so getting you all up in here. There we go. Okay. All right, here's Doug chat. So, yeah, what'd you think of, all this talk? I saw that you mentioned we had, 2 guests from the Earth Institute today?
Yeah, well, congrats on your episode. Very interesting and really cool series you're doing. It's, Jeff is doing some really important work. And yeah, so the Ruth DeFries earlier today, she's at the Earth Institute, and they should have their own Simpatico channel. They could keep us populated with guests forever. I mean, I referred to it earlier as a murderer's row of just like, top-notch people there at the Earth Institute. So, and Jeff keeping in with that tradition. So what'd you think?
Oh, I enjoy talking with Jeff so much. Like, it's one of those things, how I really enjoyed having Gerald on and I get to talk with Jeff. I'm like, oh no, like I have two more episodes with him. And this book has been just fascinating to go through, as it's all realizing how related everything is, which I mean is like the whole point of Simpatico, right? We're seeing like the intersectionality of literally everything. And yeah, like it's been really informative, and I definitely after this I would love to have him like come back on to talk about like other research that like the Institute is doing. Kind of thing.
So when you first, I guess you were, my green screen isn't completely covering everything. I've got Simpatico. I guess it doesn't really matter. I don't have Megan on. When you first kind of started off with Jeff, I mean, what were your sort of expectations? You've got these multiple episodes, but like, what were you thinking on the ground that you wanted to cover? And so today, there was a particular subject, and next week will be different. But I mean, like in your own homework and stuff, what kind of, I'm assuming you do a little bit of homework, but what kind of stood out as you got ready to chat with Jeff?
Well, just like how these things like matter, right? So like when I think about infrastructure, like with today's episode, it's like, oh, roads and potholes is like the first thing. But then you realize, oh wait, but there's also what happened with Flint, and then there's things that happen with dams, and there's also just the way that certain buildings are built. You look at what happened with Katrina. And so the more that I've been diving into like these details for these chapters, doing like extra Googling and everything like that, it's like, wow, realizing that there is so much that needs to be done, and also realizing that the way that all this just gets accomplished is we need to have better conversations at the end of the day. As a lot of the stuff, if we had better legislation, if we were able to just like sit and talk without it being like, oh, well, you're pushing a leftist agenda to go and make it so that way our roads are okay, or it's like, well, no, I mean, if the roads are good, then it'll help Republicans. Your car will be better.
Not even sure if they believe that anymore. Well, you look at his position, and I didn't, I haven't done my homework on him. Like, it's just, I have a page open. I was kind of really curious at just some of the stuff that he's done, and obviously he's involved with government activities, but he's an academic at Columbia too. And I'm just interested, and to me that in itself would be a cool episode, just chatting about that, and you guys talked about a little bit, but just the intersection of like, he has this expertise, he's doing the things that he's doing, but like, how does the government really take advantage of some of the work that he's doing? And, he's involved with some of these government initiatives, but that's different than saying being a government employee and such. And, is he there going, is it the government's doing it wrong? And, just really how his expertise is used, and what does that look like? That to me is just interesting stuff.
I think there's definitely a lot of room for like more conversations about like how the actual like institute functions, what they're doing, how they're influencing things. He actually just shared with me earlier. They just published their report on how 130,000 to 210,000 avoidable COVID-19 deaths and counting in the U.S. That was just published today by the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. And so this has been getting some traction, and he thinks it might be talked about in the debate tonight. But yeah, I mean, like these kinds of reports and everything, I would love to just keep like bringing him back on, and like him and his colleagues, and be like, hey, let's break this down. Like, what was the process? What's the goal? Like, is this being utilized? That kind of thing.
It occurred to me as I was watching you and him next to him, and it had his name and his title there. And it looked like he was in his attic or something like that. He's obviously at his home. And I just thought the symbolism, and nothing to do with him. Obviously, he's just working from him. I get it. But just like the notion of like national, disaster preparedness, hunkered up in the attic, kind of, it's sort of the sign of the times of what's going on in the United States. And it's just, and again, this is not, he was just doing his from his house. It wasn't a reflection on him, but it was just more of a symbolic of America. I thought it was kind of funny seeing that. I'm like, oh, right. Mm-hmm. We're not at our peak moment at the moment. So
yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. And I'm just glad that we're able to, have these kind of conversations, that Simpatico is here so we can do these kinds of things. But
all right. Well, next week, I've already forgotten though. So what's the topic for next week?
Cybersecurity next week.
Oh, right. That's right. Well, yes. That's kind of cool. What are you kind of speculating you'll talk about?
Well, if I go and pull up the chapter, we will be talking about so we have like cyber adversaries, like grouped in like categories, and like Google, Facebook, like the internet, like hacking, like hacking infrastructure, mentioned like the Ukraine attack, like where there was an attack on a grid, and a bunch of like, just like cyber like hacking and attacks and going after grids and people's information and like money and all that stuff. So, and that'll be definitely really interesting, I think.
Well, you ask your own questions. I'll be in the chat room asking mine. It's a fascinating subject, and right now, I mean, people don't appreciate it, and I think that's part of the problem. And that'd be a question I ask: is that we are currently under attack by the Russians in this election. There was an intelligence saying we are currently under attack, like we were in 2016. And I would ask him, like, how could you convey the urgency of being under attack, to the public? Because it just sort of feels like we're like, it's a cyber war. And it's like, they're attacking us. And it doesn't seem like we know how to react to what that really means. I would be curious to see what he has to say.
Yeah, I mean, because cyber is so new, right? The internet was what, like early 90s, right? Or this is me being like a just completely ignorant 24-year-old.
It's been around for a while, but like it really exploded probably 94, 95 is when you started seeing things kind of explode. But, it government-wise, it had been around a bit longer. So
yeah,
much longer, actually.
But anyway, I hope, well, next week, Jeff will be joining again on Thursday. And yeah, Lee has an episode coming up. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up and let her get started.
Oh, is it right at 5?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man, I didn't know. Sorry. I just kept blabbering on. All right. Lee's going up. Okay. Well, cool. All right.
All right.
Great chatting.